And we are starting chapter 3. So it's kind of split up into three different like lecture series, I should say. So right now we're going to go over types of metabolic reactions. And then next, the next video will be covering metabolic reactions, energy, and reaction rates. So that would be the second one. And then the third is dealing with essentially cellular respiration. And so that is talking about ATP and how energy is transferred from the food we eat, like glucose and triglycerides or fats, to ATP molecules. So our cells have an energy source. But first, let's talk about types of metabolic reactions. And in order to really get into what these reactions are, let's first define metabolism, right? So we're going to define it, which is the sum of all chemical reactions occurring in a cell. That is really what your metabolic rate is. What's going on in your cells? What do we need energy for to drive all of these reactions in your cells? And it could be either the synthesis or breakdown of organic molecules. So if we need to build structures, right? That's synthesizing. If we need to break down stored glycogen, which is carbohydrates, that is also a reaction that's going to occur. And the second thing is in this process of chemical reactions, there's a release of chemical energy. And this is what powers our cellular activities. And so basically, cells store potential energy in a high energy phosphate bond in adenosine triphosphate. So this is the energy source of cells. Cells can't use glucose. It can't use the potential energy in a glucose molecule. It can't use the potential energy in a triglyceride molecule. It has to actually have that potential energy from glucose and triglycerides transferred to these high energy phosphate bonds in ATP. And so the reactions, these chemical reactions that are transferring this potential energy is one of the big drivers of our metabolic and metabolism. And so these are called metabolic pathways. They're just series of metabolic reactions in which one product of one reaction serves as the reactant in the next product. So when I migrate over my PowerPoints into Notability, it always ends up a little funky. So I'm going to draw this out for you, which would be an arrow. So if you have product A, it's going to be converted into product B, which then can be converted into product C, which can eventually become product D, which may be the end product. And so whatever you start with is called the initial substrate. And the initial substrate is going to be then transferred, become intermediates, which will, you can have 2 intermediates, you can have 20 intermediates. Eventually, you're going to end up with an end product, and that's what you end up with. And so this would be a metabolic pathway. An example of a metabolic pathway would be glycolysis, which we're going to talk about, right? That's a metabolic pathway. Beta oxidation, another metabolic pathway. So there are several. And so your metabolism is the sum of all these different metabolic pathways that can happen in the cell. Again, this is supposed to be an arrow, right? So you have substrates becoming products. And that's supposed to be an arrow. Substrates becoming products. this would be a forward reaction. They can also be reverse, and they can be bidirectional. So bidirectional means it can go from A to B to C to D, or it can go from C to D back to A to B. Reactant molecules are being converted to product, while some products are being converted back to reactants. So it's not always just a one-way street. It can be two ways. So again, summary: metabolic reactions, chemical reactions occurring in the body. The two main types are catabolic reactions. RXN means reaction, and anabolic reactions. Catabolic means to break down. So you're breaking down larger molecules into smaller ones. Anabolic, you're actually building or synthesizing. And so you're making a bigger molecule by combining a bunch of smaller molecules together. So this is kind of a prettier slide, I would say, is that anabolic reactions is anabolism. And it's all the reactions in which larger molecules are built from smaller ones. So anabolic synthesize buildup. An example would be amino acids bonding together to make a protein, right? Primary structure or conformation of a protein. That is an anabolic process. Second one would be catabolism or catabolic. It's where you're breaking down a larger, more complex structure into simple ones. An example of that is glycolysis, right? So you start with, or let's start with glycogen. This is stored polysaccharide. So you store this in your liver and skeletal muscles, right? So it's stored carbohydrates, stored glucose, but it's connected. So all these glucose molecules are connected to one another. And so you can catabolize or break down glycogen into glucose molecules. And then each glucose molecule can go through glycolysis. I'm not a great speller, as you guys realized. And that's going to break glucose down into two pyruvic acid molecules. Again, breaking one molecule down into two smaller ones, right? Glucose is 6 carbons, and pyruvic acid is really 3 carbons. And so you're breaking down. So that's catabolism. Other metabolic reactions: hydrolysis and condensation. We'll go over phosphorylation and dephosphorylation, and then oxidation reduction. So first is hydrolysis, and hydro is referring to water. And whenever you see lysis, lysis means to split. So hydro means water, and lysis means split. So it's just like it sounds. You're using water to split a big molecule into smaller molecules. That makes it a catabolic reaction. So most catabolic reactions in the body are hydraulic reactions or hydrolysis, because the majority of our body is water, right? And so we're going to use water to break bigger molecules down into smaller molecules. So here's an example: sucrose. This is what we call, this is table sugar. And you have a glucose molecule and you have a fructose molecule, and they're bonded right there. And we're going to use water to break this disaccharide into monosaccharides, and to do single molecules. We're going to use water to do that. And so how do we use water? Well, we take water and we're going to attach an OH, remember water is 2 hydrogen and oxygen, onto the glucose. and we're going to attach a hydrogen onto the fructose to separate them. So we're separating and we're doing the OH over here and we're doing the H there. And we have consumed that water, right? We've used the water to separate those two molecules and then kind of cap them off and make a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. So that's a hydraulic or catabolic reaction. Condensation is going to be the opposite. You're condensing, right? You're taking two single molecules and you're going to combine them into one. So you're taking two monosaccharides in this example, and you're going to make it into a disaccharide. And so you're going to pull off the hydroxyl off the glucose, and you're going to pull off the hydrogen off the fructose, and it's going to form water. And in the process, it's going to establish a bond here. And so you can see now there is a bonding between the two, and we've pulled out water. So that's a condensation or condensing or bringing water out. It's also sometimes called condensation, or I can't think now. It'll hopefully come to me. Moving on, phosphorylation, just like it sounds, you're adding a phosphate group. It's also a condensation. Why? Because a lot of times we use water, right? We're pulling out water. So again, it's going to be a hydroxyl off one and a hydrogen off the other, getting pulled out when we bind the inorganic phosphate to adenosine diphosphate. So you're adding that phosphate group. If you're removing the phosphate group, it's just dephosphorylizing or removing the phosphate group. This would be a hydrolysis. Why? Because we are using water to break it apart. And so water, you're going to end up with hydroxyl on one and a hydrogen on the other to split it apart. The last one we're going to go over is oxidation reduction. So oxidation is the removal of electrons. Here's how you remember oxidation reduction. Oil rig. We have oil rigs off the coast of Oxnard, Ventura, Santa Barbara. And if you can remember oil rigs, it's oxidation loses and reduction gains. And what are they losing and gaining? They're losing and gaining hydrogens or protons and electrons. Protons and electrons. And oxidation reduction happens all the time because we're moving around protons and electrons. And so with oxidation, you're removing or losing the electrons, or removing or losing the protons. And in reduction, you're going to be gaining those protons and electrons. Why? Because oxygen has the ability to pull electrons away from other molecules. And so we say oxidizing just because oxygen has that ability. But anything can be oxidized if it's losing electrons and other and protons. So oxidation is any reaction that removes electrons from a molecule or removes hydrogen, which carries an electron. Reduction is the opposite. You're adding or gaining electrons and protons, right? So oil rig, oxidation reactions. Whoops, I was about to write the wrong thing. Loses electrons, and protons. Reduction, reactions, gains, electrons, and protons. And so examples of this. This is showing you an oxidation reduction, right? It's bidirectional. And so a lot of molecules can be oxidized and then reduced, and then they go back and get reoxidized and then re-reduced, vice versa. So in this case, it's showing you NAD, and it is gaining a proton and 2 electrons and becoming NADH. Thus, it's said to be reduced. Oxidation would be the opposite. You're taking off protons and electrons and losing those electrons and protons, and so you are oxidizing. So oxidation reduction, oil, rig. Oxidized substances lose electrons and protons, reduced substances gain electrons and protons. And we are going to talk about this extensively when we talk about Krebs cycle, but also glycolysis, and to a lesser extent, electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. This is how we're transferring energy. These NADs and FADs, these nucleotides, are getting reduced, grabbing hydrogen and electrons, and then carrying them to the electron transport chain to become oxidized or losing, giving up those electrons and protons. And it's really the electrons and protons are transferring energy. So these oxidation reduction reactions are really important. And when we get into cellular respiration, in glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, we are constantly reducing the nucleotides, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide or NAD and flavin adenine dinucleotide or FAD. And they are getting oxidized and reduced constantly. So this is showing you in glycolysis, NAD here is getting reduced. It's gained protons and electrons, and it's going to take those electrons and protons to the Krebs cycle, and then ultimately to the electron transport chain. So this is a really important part of cellular respiration, and that's why we're going over it. So we'll see you next time.